When passengers stepped into a local subway yesterday afternoon, they witnessed a strange scene that would probably never be repeated in their lifetime. A clearly distressed bride was sitting in one of the seats, crying her eyes out. But things got even stranger when police walked in to arrest this poor woman. Bride is spotted crying in subway. Moments later, police come in and arrest her. To understand why these bizarre events happened, we need to understand why the young bride was there in the first place. Just a few hours before, Judith was at her wedding location, getting ready for the best day of her life. She was overjoyed to get married, but this wedding would have a strange twist. Judith's makeup was on point, and the ceremony was about to begin, so her father walked into her dressing room to guide her down the aisle. There was only one problem on the horizon. When Judith and her father took their first steps on the aisle, they were met with confused faces. The confused faces scared Judith as her gaze moved toward the front of the aisle where the altar was placed. Her eyes grew large the moment she did that, as she could not spot her soon-to-be husband, Dean, anywhere. Judith stepped toward the podium slowly and asked the ceremonial master where Dean was. However, the man was just as confused as Judith and simply presented her with a letter that apparently came from her boyfriend. Judith opened the piece of paper, which was indeed in his handwriting. Dean stated that he was so sorry, but he just couldn't do this. "I have to go." There was not a whole lot of additional information given, and the ceremonial master didn't know anything more. He seemed nervous. "Then he gave me this letter and just left in a hurry." Judith broke down in tears as panic coursed through her body. And then she did something pure instinctively. The distressed bride started moving away from the altar. The first steps were slow, but she soon ran away from her wedding location entirely. Judith didn't know what she was doing, but for some reason, she just kept running all the way into the busy city center. Until she finally arrived at a subway station. The poor bride stepped inside one of the trains and sat in a random seat, where her tears flowed even more vigorously. This, of course, caught the attention of her fellow travelers, who all looked at the woman in white with confused stares, justifiably so, because this wasn't something you see every day. Judith eventually moved her face upward out of the palms of her hands and stared around for the first time. She noticed the worried and staring faces, and that's when reality hit her. What am I doing? What was I thinking? The young bride started hyperventilating, and passengers walked up to check on her, but before the helping subway passengers got the chance to come close to Judith, they were all rudely interrupted. The train had just made it to its first stop at that point. A bleep was heard, and the doors opened. And with it, two large men in uniform walked into the train. They were policemen. The two police officers immediately walked toward the crying Judith, pushing fellow travelers aside to get to the bride. Judith saw the policemen coming and looked at the uniformed men with a confusing stare. Once they arrived at her location, Judith asked them what was going on. But then something unexpected happened. The two officers did not reply to Judith's question and moved closer while looking menacing at the half-crying woman. They stretched out their arms and lifted the white-dressed woman out of her seat. Passengers tried to intervene, pleading for sympathy for poor Judith. But the officers simply arrested her and escorted Judith outside. Bystanders were shocked when the arrest occurred, and Judith might have been the most confused. The distressed bride didn't understand at all why this was happening and asked the police officers about it. "Why are you arresting me? Did someone on the train call the police on me? I just sat down." The two uniformed men again did not answer, which made Judith even more scared. Her thoughts started to linger. Why was this all happening to me? Could this day get any worse? First, I was left at the altar with no explanation whatsoever. And now I'm getting arrested. What is going on? The two burly men guided Judith through the subway station to the police car, which was waiting for her outside the building. All the while, Judith kept pleading for her innocence. She made her voice known and drew a lot of attention to the situation. "I don't know anything. Please let me go." When Judith eventually was seated in the back of the police car, she tried to explain her situation in a more calm voice. She explained that her panic and awkward situation in the subway was because she was left at the altar. I panicked and just ran until I reached the subway by accident. My boyfriend never gave me any explanation as to why he fled the wedding and left me there all by myself. He just gave me a letter and bolted. So you must understand my frantic state, officer. I know the situation in the subway was odd, but look at it from my perspective, Judith pleaded. But that's when one of the policemen finally spoke. And what he said was something Judith never saw coming. He turned his head toward the confused bride in the back of the car and stated they were already aware of all this information. What? But how? Judith asked loudly. The officer then went on to explain that both of them were present at her wedding and saw the entire ordeal unfold. They sat in the audience and witnessed the empty stage where her boyfriend, Dean, needed to be. They also saw how Judith ran away out of nowhere. Judith couldn't believe it. She knew everyone on the guest list since she carefully planned every aspect of this wedding herself. And the two policemen were definitely not on the guest list. The officer said that this was true, but they were there undercover. They had been secretly watching Judith's boyfriend for months now. Judith began to worry even more after that police officer presented her with this revelation. Why would two police officers go through all this trouble to spy on my boyfriend? I mean, you even went as far as to infiltrate my wedding. Dean is just a normal guy. What could he have done? But the officer explained to Judith that her loving boyfriend had a secret. Dean is not who he says he is, and he has been operating secretly for quite some time now. Judith was perplexed at that point. And it wasn't just because of this accusation. There was something else she noticed. The driving officer kept his eye on the road, but the one who explained their undercover mission looked at Judith with a serious and judging face. And that serious face also came with a tone of voice that became increasingly accusing. Before Judith could reply, though, the car arrived at the police station. The bride's tears had all dried up, and now only confusion remained. She was guided to an interrogation room where another policeman was already waiting for her. Sit down, Miss Hudson. I'll come straight to business. We've been watching your boyfriend, Dean, for a while now. He's a suspect in some illegal activities. The stern-looking officer said that the fact that Dean went missing at his own wedding made him even more suspicious. And the fact that you ran away yourself also puts you on our radar. Do you know more about this? Judith quickly pleaded her innocence once more, saying she knew nothing. Panic was audible in her voice, and her confused words seemed convincing. But the lead officer suggested a polygraph test to be sure. Judith answered a buckload of questions, each one more incriminating than the one before. But luckily for her, she passed the test with flying colors. All right, we believe you. With this gained trust, the lead officer promised to share with her what they knew. This man left her at the altar, so she at least deserved some form of explanation. Dean's case first came on our radar about 6 months ago. It involved large purchases all around town, made with fake money. At first, the businesses did not notice the false payment. But after one company reported the trickery, many others followed. Soon, our desks were covered with reports of goods purchased with fake cash. And the funny thing is, they all reported the same indisputable sighting. One that might be known to you. The policeman told Judith that every time a purchase was made, the suspect drove away in a truck owned by Dean's company. Since Dean's business was one-man owned, it instantly put the young entrepreneur on their radar. We even found camera footage from street signs that prove it is, in fact, his truck. Ever since this discovery, the police tracked Dean's every movement. He was involved in a large-scale money scandal that much was certain, and law enforcement could have arrested Judith's boyfriend a long time ago. But we think Dean is just one part of a larger organization. And we want the big fish. Judith couldn't believe her ears. She felt like she knew her boyfriend well. They had been together since high school, and Dean never showed signs of criminal activity. So even though he left her at the altar, which Judith was still upset about, she pleaded for his innocence. I want to prove he's not guilty. The police accepted Judith's request and explained that there was one way in which she could help resolve the issue right away. They needed access to Dean's company's warehouse. But they needed an extensive warrant to do that. But with Judith's permission, they could visit right away. Police were convinced that incriminating evidence was inside. But Judith didn't believe this to be true, so she approved their request and granted the police access to the company. She traveled with the team as they drove to their house first to retrieve the spare key. Judith quickly changed into normal street clothes and snatched the key for the kitchen drawer. Just 15 minutes later, Judith and 4 police cars arrived at the company's warehouse. The present police officers waited and were ready for action, but first, Judith needed to insert the key and open the main door. The confused girlfriend expected to find nothing. But once the door to the warehouse was opened, the eyes of the confused ex-bride widened instantly. Judith saw numerous expensive cars and other goods of great value. They were all out in the open now. And accompanying them were multiple pallets filled with cash, all presumably fake. What is this? Judith's mind went into overdrive. Her almost husband was an innocent man, right? She knew him so well, for so many years. But did she really? This sighting confused Judith tremendously. She wanted answers, but wanted to hear them from Dean himself. "I want to help with the search," Judith suddenly said. Judith explained that there was only one place she could think of where Dean could be hiding. "I will show you," Judith now said, determined. Together with the team of officers, Judith drove away from the city to a place about 30 miles removed from the company. She navigated while explaining some about the destination. Judith said that it was an old fishing cabin owned by Dean's family. Nobody knows about it except for Dean's relatives and me. He goes there sometimes to have some alone time and to fish. The cabin appeared in the distance after a short drive to a more woodland area. Nervously, Judith stood behind the officers as they kicked in the door and ventured inside. And it didn't take them long to find their target. Dean was huddled up in a corner of the main room. Judith saw that he looked scared as the uniformed men approached. And that's when his girlfriend did the unexpected. Judith's anger instantly dissipated when she saw Dean's frightened face. She pushed through the sea of policemen, who were in the middle of their arrest, and yelled. "Stop!" Was the word leaving Judith's mouth? "Can't you see that this is not the face of a criminal? Please let him explain before judging him." Judith was convincing. Her desperate and words of concern for her boyfriend made the uniformed men back off. It was a powerful moment, and it also gave Dean the confidence to speak. He promised to tell the officers and his girlfriend everything. It all started when 2 individuals entered my warehouse. The 2 men asked Dean if they could hire his company's truck. According to them, it would be used as a moving truck for their company's relocation. Dean was not in the truck rental business since he owned a simple carpenter's business. But they paid well, and he didn't need the truck that day. But things quickly took a turn after that. The men came by multiple times just in that first week. And those times, they didn't just come by to rent his truck. They also unloaded multiple items from Dean's truck: cars, designer items, jewelry, and mountains worth of cash. And they had guns. Dean said, frightened. The individuals threatened Dean and told him that if he did not cooperate, he would perish on the floor of his warehouse. They also threatened to harm my family and loved ones. Dean said he had no choice. He had to cooperate. That's when his warehouse became a storage facility for all their illegal goods. Dean promised to help the criminals, so he borrowed his truck whenever needed and opened his warehouse for them to store stuff. But his ties with these criminal figures also made Dean paranoid. He saw threatening eyes everywhere. So when I noticed 2 unknown men at my wedding, I got scared and ran. Dean's statement amazed the officers, and they believed every word. They quickly rectified his wedding scare by stating that the 2 unknown men were police officers. But that didn't help Dean's frightened state because the criminals were still out there, and they posed a threat. "Maybe we can help with that," the lead officer spoke. Dean sighed in relief when the officers spoke those words. He wanted this nightmare to be over, so he agreed to lend his assistance in resolving this case. "What do you want me to do?" Together, they forged a plan to capture these crooks once and for all. And it started with a phone call. By pure luck, the criminals called Dean about an hour later for another drop. Dean was still with the police and permitted the criminals to use his warehouse later that evening. The criminals agreed, not knowing that it was a perfectly timed trap. The policemen hid in the warehouse come nightfall, and then the sun dropped, and the doors to Dean's warehouse opened, revealing the faces of the two criminals. They stepped in, and Dean quietly closed the exit door and locked it behind them. Shortly after, the police jumped out and quickly arrested both of them. It was finally over. Dean and everyone he loved was safe. Dean was finally free of this secretive burden. And with his and Judith's safety assured, a wedding could finally take place. About a month later, the two lovebirds married. This time, it was with just a small crowd of family and loved ones. It didn't matter, it was perfect this way.